Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 254 of the Board Game Barrage podcast. So close to being a very cool number, 255. Computer science nerds will know exactly what I mean. But 254 is good enough. We're almost there. This is me hosting from South Africa with none other than the Green Tank Mark. Hello.
Yes. Hello. Hi.
Yeah, just to repay the favor of kicking me out from the episode 2 weeks ago, who decided to boot Kellen from this one.
Yeah, I mean, as long as I don't get kicked out, I really don't care what the configuration is as long as I'm here. So it's fine either way.
I think we've learned that you will do anything to make sure that you're
the streak survives
on the episode, even if it's just in the final moments.
That's right. Yeah, as long as it counts in the record book, then that's all I care.
This week on the show, what we're going to be talking about is some innovation in board game design. So like little things that we've noticed that have like sort of snuck in the last year or so that are just like becoming prominent, or we're just starting to see games experiment with little twists on designs and components.
Yeah, also a nod to our dearly departed is too strong a word, but our missing tank, Kellen, even though he couldn't be here, we decided to go with a topic that matched his favorite game of all time. So if
I love the idea that we could just title the episode all about innovation, and then Kellen can see that and be like, wait, what?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Before we get there, though, we're going to be talking about some of the games that we've been playing this week, or in my case, before I left America. But we're going to be talking about Paint the Roses, which Mark's going to run us through, and ISS Vanguard, my early impressions of one of the bigger recent Kickstarters. So let's kick it off with Paint the Roses, Mark. Tell us what it's all about.
Yeah. One thing I've noticed over the years of doing this podcast, and perhaps because we've done this podcast, is the way that my gaming tastes have changed over the years. Apropos to this week's topic, I used to be a person who thought I derived all my joy from games purely based on mechanics, and that production or innovation in that regard or artwork sort of be damned. And I've since...
Yeah, you used to have this weird fixation about Biblios as well, like, you know, a lot of bad games. Your tastes have improved over the years, I will say
yeah, I can't wait to do our top 50 to show exactly how much they've improved. Anyhow, I've since discovered that either that was never the case or my tastes have changed, as Neelan just mentioned, and I appreciate how important art and production can be to the experience of a board game. Same goes with solo games, which I never thought I'd be interested in, that I've increasingly dipped my toes into over the past year or so. And the same, perhaps to a lesser extent, goes with co-op games, which I generally haven't enjoyed so much. Perhaps unsurprisingly, though I've never really considered it, is that the one time where I do get more into co-op games is the holidays, when and I think many people probably find themselves around more non-gamery folks. And so we find ourselves in the holiday season now, and I found myself playing Paint the Roses, designed by Ben Goldman and published by North Star Games, a co-op game I brought out with a combination of gamery and non-gamery folks over the last week or so. Paint the Roses is a co-op deduction game where you're trying to fill the Queen's Garden. This is a Alice in Wonderland themed game. So trying to fill the garden, which is represented by a shared board with flowers represented by tiles, before she changes her mind and chops off your heads in her off with her head style. Filling the garden isn't the tricky bit, as every round you're going to be taking turns selecting a tile from an array and placing it on the board, therefore filling the garden one more piece. The tough part is going to be avoiding being caught by the queen, who is represented by a little miniature that chases your miniature around the edge of the board. She advances an ever-increasing number of spots as the game progresses, getting faster and faster. The way that you move your piece to avoid her has to do with the cards that everyone around the table will have in their hands and will determine which piece of the different types of flowers that they're going to play. The cards are the crux of the game, and they come in 3 varieties. There are easy, medium, and hard, and each of them shows a criteria. The easy cards show 2 colors. The medium cards either show 2 colors or 2 shapes, and then the hard cards will either show 2 colors, 2 shapes, or a shape and a color. So those are the combinations that can be on the other side of these easy, medium, and hard cards. When you place a piece, you can also put a number of cubes on that piece corresponding with how many times the criteria on your card is met by placing the new piece. So this is sort of like the main part of the game. So if I have an easy card, and my card, which is always color to color, shows yellow touching red, so it'll have a yellow plus red, and I place a yellow flower on the board that touches 2 pre-existing red flowers, I would put 2 cubes on it, showing that my card's criteria has been met twice. if I have a medium card that shows a diamond-shaped flower next to a heart-shaped flower, I do the same thing when I place a tile. And then the hard level cards can match a color, say yellow to yellow, can match a shape, say diamond to diamond, or can match a color to a shape. So you can have yellow matching diamond. And then again, whenever you place a tile, you indicate how many times your card's criteria has been met by placing cubes on that tile. After you've done that, everyone else that you're playing with places cubes on that tile, showing how many times their criteria has been met when you place that tile. So you're offering information about your card when you place a tile, but you're also drawing information out about everybody else's card at the same time. Then everyone around the table can discuss the new information without talking about their own cards, obviously. And then you as a team have to make a guess about at least one person's card. If you get it right, you get to move your piece around the edge of the board a number of spaces depending on the level of card. So for example, easy cards move you 1 to 2 spaces typically, all the way up to hard cards, which can move you up to 5 to 6 spaces if you guess correctly. And as I said, you can guess as often as you want. You can try to guess everyone's card if you want. But if you ever miss, the queen immediately gets to move double her normal speed, which can be and will be absolutely crushing if it ever happens to you, especially late in the game when her base speed might be like 4 spaces, and then all of a sudden you guess wrong and she moves 8 spaces, and you find yourself probably lost at that point, if not close to it. And you will be guessing. When I read the rules, I thought the game would be quite easy, but after a round or two, you quickly realize how hard it is. There's a lot of thinking like, wait, why would they choose that piece to put on the board and then place no cubes on it? What flowers could they have picked from the array, and why did they pick that one? So there's a lot of think and double think and trying to make inferences, a little like Hanabi style, where you would try to figure out why someone is not giving you information about a certain card. So you're trying to infer a lot of things often, especially late in the game, especially with harder cards.
So I have one question actually about this, which is a problem I frequently have with this style of like logical cooperative game, which is how much of this is revolving around individuals making, these deductions and having to put themselves out there, as it were, and how much is a group discussion. Because I often feel like a game that leans too far in one direction or the other can be problematic. Like if you're over-reliant on someone not to mess up.
Right. So there is definitely that. I will say that messing up is quite difficult once the rules have been sort of figured out, because there's not much to the giving of information. It's like your card will either show 2 colors, 2 shapes, or a shape and a color, and it's sort of easy to figure out how many cubes you should put on it. There's not a lot of leaps or a lot of calculation you have to do when it comes to giving the information out.
And that's the individual component.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the individual component is the number of cubes you're going to put out there, the information you're sharing to the board, and that is pretty straightforward. You don't really have to worry too much about somebody messing up the giving of information. It's the team talk, the figuring out, okay, what does that tell us, where you could mess up the game.
And that feels like the larger core of the actual deduction of the game, right?
Yeah, 100%, 100%. It is nice, as you sort of are alluding to, like, games where you worry that somebody's messed something up because it's a little difficult to figure out, and therefore you're going to lose based on a mistake. You're not going to lose this based on a mistake. What you are going to lose it on is based on the guessing part of it.
Got it.
And that sort of makes Paint the Roses a tough game to sort of place. I think if your family and friends like deduction, you'll probably like it. There's a bit of a luck factor given the cards and the pieces that you draw that might hurt that. Even more of an impact towards that is the fact that I spoke about where you'll often have to guess a card. I think there's a portion of the deduction-loving crowd who will want to deduce something to the very end before taking a guess. I totally get that because that's sort of inherent in deduction, but you're not going to get that a lot of times with Paint the Roses. The fact that you're forced to guess every turn quickly goes from like, oh, this is trivial. Obviously, they put 3 cubes on that. They're matching red to red or whatever. This goes obvious. And then towards the end of the game, you can calculate it all you want. You're going to get at best sometimes like a 60% chance of being right or a 50-50 or something like that. And that, I think, can put people off. There's also the idea that this game sells, it's on the box, in fact, where they say that this game scales to your skill level, since you can have players who don't really like deduction still play and just pick the easy cards to simplify things, where it's always color to color. It's not like much to think about. And that's true. However, you can only ever have one easy card according to the rules at a time among all the players, which is sort of a limiting thing about that. But more importantly, I think you can still get some of the alpha gamering issue when it comes to the deduction part of things. Since in the open discussion that you have as a team, stronger deduction players can often steer the conversation. So sure, like a weaker player doesn't have to worry about how many cubes they put out or all that stuff. But when it comes to the discussion, which is like a big part of the game, if you really know your stuff with deduction, you can sort of steer how the team is going to go. That might not be the worst thing in the world, since players who don't like deduction might not want to have a lot of the burden of the actual deducing on them, but still, it feels like not the greatest solution to players who aren't big fans of deduction. I will say that our groups liked it, although it wasn't a resounding success. I found a few of the more gamery folks were a bit put off by the luck, and while some of the non-gamery folks were overwhelmed by the amount of deduction, especially towards the end. But most people did sort of fall in the middle and enjoyed it. And the luck, which sort of assure the game is going to be difficult, the fact that you cannot often deduce to the very end, sort of foster this sense of like camaraderie, like a let's beat this thing. Like, because it's so difficult, you get these like guesses that, you know, you're going to be forced to guess. And it made it like a us versus the game thing, really sort of like tied that bond together. So mainly positive for me. Just be aware of how your individual group might react to those unique aspects of Paint the Roses by Ben Goldman and North Star Game Studios.
I'm glad that's finally out because, you know, a little behind the scenes, this is something that we saw in early prototype form a very long time ago, like early in the podcast life. I wouldn't say our first Gen Con together.
Yeah.
And it's kind of one that, you know, even though I don't necessarily... You could have just said something completely different for the rules explanation. I would have totally believed you because I just really don't remember that far back. But I remember being intrigued by it. So
yeah.
The fact that it's kind of like netted out as pretty good is cool to hear.
Yeah, I think you're going to like this. I think you like the puzzly games with the deduction games. Yeah.
I am a little bit worried about the quarterbacking problem in the context of a deduction game. Like, it just feels like potentially the loudest, strongest deduction voice might, you know,
it's something where you have to sort of self-regulate, which is not for me the best way to handle quarterbacking issues. But I don't know if there's, you know, a way around it in this game aside from players reining themselves in.
Sure. Cool. I am going to be talking about ISS Vanguard. So like I mentioned at the top, this was a very recently fulfilled Kickstarter. This is the latest one to be fulfilled by Awaken Realms. They are most well regarded for Nemesis probably at this point, but they've also did Lords of Hellas, which was a sort of hybrid 4X game, and then Tainted Grail, which is like this elaborate campaign storytelling game. So they have a fair bit of variety in their output, although Tainted Grail is probably the closest comparison point to what ISS Vanguard is. So to kind of be as reductive as possible, because there's a lot to explain in this game, and I'm not going to necessarily explain all of it in intricate detail, but like Tainted Grail, this is sort of a choose-your-own-adventure style of narrative, where, unlike that game, it does proceed in very discrete missions. So you are in a sci-fi setting. The most closest analogy, which is one that they're very heavily leaning into a lot of ways, is if you're familiar with the video game Mass Effect. So that style of crew on a spaceship in like a very glitzy sci-fi future. The very basics of the story is that you're investigating this, effectively a new solar system that appears out of nowhere. And you're exploring all of the planets within it to uncover like a core mystery. The way that plays out is divided into two distinct phases. So you have the away missions, where you have a small crew of between 2 to 4 crew members on a planet exploring locations. The way that works out is you have a map of the planet which divides the planet into sort of discrete card sections. Your crew will all start in one location where they land on that planet, and they will all take actions on their turns to move to a location, take a specific action that is dictated on that card, which typically corresponds to an entry in a giant choose-your-own-adventure style journal. The ramifications of that will typically be very dependent on what your current mission is, whether you're exploring this planet, whether you're trying to achieve a specific objective, like, say, for example, turning the power back on so that you can escape or something like that. And all of this is sort of handled through dice checks. So every crew member has a pool of dice, and these are very, very, very custom dice. So they come in 3 distinct colors, which sort of broadly represent strength, agility, intelligence, like that sort of realm of things. But each of the dice also has a bunch of different varieties of them that depict certain symbols. So there are, I think it's 3 in each of the colors, very distinct skills associated with those colors. And a skill check might say, for example, you're going to be required to hit 2 bicep symbols, which is what one of the symbols on the strength die is. So you're going to choose how many dice you want to roll those dice, trying to fulfill that condition with a lot of cards that you can play to mitigate that, ways to turn those cards into wilds, ways that you can instead, recoup dice. But any of the dice you rolled are then permanently in your spend pool. Even if you over qualify for the check, all those dice get spent. So it's about choosing how many dice you want to choose in any given moment, because recovering those dice is sort of a limited resource. You have rations on any given away mission, and you can only rest so often to get those dice back until you're eventually just sort of out of your ability to do anything and you lose the mission effectively, which very much can happen. The way that each of these missions plays out is pretty distinct, and this is the thing I don't have the biggest feel for yet. I've only done about 2 or 3 of these so far, but the thing I was impressed by, even just in that early smattering, is kind of how they make them feel very distinct. Like, one does devolve into an escape, where you have a timer. One is a little bit more exploratory, where you're sort of trying to figure out what this sort of civilization is. The story element, the narrative, the writing is actually really, really strong. Like, I kind of felt like this style of game obviously lives and dies on the strength of its writing, and I felt this one was really good. I thought that the descriptions of the locations you're visiting are very evocative. It's also paired with a fully voice-acted app, which I highly recommend if you're planning on playing this. Surprisingly good voice acting. Good performances in a way that just sort of brings the whole world to life. Like, you're hearing the crew talk back and forth to each other, that sort of thing. Then there's this whole second half of the game. And where this becomes fascinating is what you start to realize over time is a lot of your crew are very distinct to your certain playthrough, because once you're back on the ship, which sort of happens between the away missions, you can go to, like, say, the barracks, where you recruit crew from this massive stack of cards, and each of these crew have different abilities, different dice associated with them. And this is where the game sort of really starts to lean into that kind of video game Mass Effect type feel, because what you're effectively doing is managing your ship, managing your crew in between missions. And there's a lot of different systems in this. You're researching items that you recovered from the planet, which can either be semi-randomized or dictated by the story of that planet.
And you choose that?
Yeah, you're choosing that. Well, it's a combination of both, right? So if I go to a specific planet, there might be unique discoveries that are part of the story of that planet, but then certain other events might just give you like a random discovery. And then when you get back to the ship, you sort of have 2 research stations. Now, which of these discoveries are you going to research next? What are they going to do? There's this brief description on the front of the card, but until you've researched it and read the back, you don't know exactly what that gets you. Typically, that could be new equipment, which you then would have to manufacture. Once you have like the blueprints for equipment, you're putting that through your engineering slot. And there's a whole timing system based by that, where like it might take multiple missions to fully research something, or multiple missions to fully engineer something, which is now equipment that you can use on your next away mission. Crew that go on an away mission are in recovery, so they can't go on the next away mission, so you sort of have to be rotating your crew in and out. And you get kind of really attached to them in different ways, because they're ranking up. So I might want to use my best crew that came up from mission 1, but that person's injured. They're in the med bay for the next 2 missions. And there's this really interesting like dynamism to like the way that your choices and the outcomes and the sort of random happenstances on away missions feed into like the intermission stuff. It's very... Again, not to lean too heavily on video game mechanisms here, but I mean, they are wholly evoking this of their own accord, right? It's very similar to something like an XCOM, which is a video game series that I'm a huge fan of, which does exactly this. You have these missions interspersed with like managing your crew, managing your base, and you just get attached to these sort of random characters that like flow into your campaign, into your story. In the last mission I did, someone got critically injured to the point that they might have died, and I really felt this like pang of like, I don't want this person to die, because they were like heavily ranked up, they had good skills, stuff that I valued.
Is part of the reason why you get that attachment have to do with the voice acting? Like, does each character have their own voice, or is there like an overall narrator? No. Or how does that work? Okay,
so just to clarify like that, the crew, as they're a part of like the mainline story, like the voice acted crew, sort of are more of like out of body narration type crew. Okay, right. Like the nitty gritty, the mechanical guys you're playing with, they're just like this from this random deck of cards.
Gotcha.
But again, it is a massive deck with very unique characters. Every single one of these people has a unique name, a unique art on them. So there is the sense of like anytime you like are recruiting people from that stack, you'll look through your options and be like, oh, I like the look of you. I like this distinct art look. So you know that their abilities and something like that.
And without maybe getting too deep into the weeds and maybe unavoidable, but just curious, where does the asymmetry come from between the characters you can pick from your crew aside from the great art?
That is a great question, and something I actually completely neglected to mention, which there are like 4 distinct like sections of the ship, which correspond to the 4 types of crew that can go on missions. So engineering, security, you know, your typical roles that you would see on like a Star Trek crew, right? And on an away mission, you're only picking 1 crew member from each of those sections at most. In fact, as a solo player, I'm typically picking 2 because managing more than 2 people felt too fiddly to me. But if you were playing this with multiple people, say 4 players, each of you would pick 1 section from each of the stations and they would go out. And each of those has their own distinct reliance on certain colors of dice. Security, as you can imagine, are leading stronger into the red dice, for example. The science crew might be leading strongly into the blue dice. So you kind of want a balanced crew. And I think the idea is, depending on the away mission, you would choose which sections are represented, because you might want more sciencey people or more. Gosh, there's so much of this. There's a whole system of like scanning the planets before you land on them, even to like ascertain what the conditions on that planet are, which crew you might want to take with it on you. Once you're on the ship, you have your crew members in your hand. And, you know, if you're doing the research, for example, you might assign a science member to accelerate the research. But then that person is also out of commission for the next mission. So there's this almost hand management system with your crew where you're deciding, do you use them on the ship or do you use them on an away mission? It's a really elaborate thing. And the way it plays out, the way it's represented, is this massive, like, what's called the ship book, but it's really like this ring binder that has like card sleeves in it. And it's all so custom and meticulous, where it'll be like, okay, if you're doing research, you know, you turn to this section of the ring binder. You grab all of your recently discovered things out of one section, slide them into card slots through the ring binder. And it just kind of feels like this very cohesive, just like log of everything that's happening on your ship. It's kind of hard to articulate without just seeing it in person, but like it's really neat.
Speaking of seeing in person, just a real quick question. I'm looking at the pictures on BGG, and the ships and the miniatures are like crazy. They're very elaborate.
Yes.
But it's always hard when you're looking at a Kickstarter's images to know if these are part of some like all-in pledge or something. Like, do you have a sense as to how elaborate the minis are for a base pledge, or like just in terms of minis in general? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that is quite clean about the base game design is it doesn't have the large majority of the miniatures in it. All of those are an extra, right?
Gotcha.
So the only miniatures that do come in the box for the base game are your crew. So you have 2 distinct sculpts for each of those 4 sections I mentioned, and they're just cosmetic. So you could just choose which mini you feel best represents the character you're taking on that away mission for each of the 4 sections. But that's pretty much it in the minis department. The rest is kind of just this elaboration of like a whole bunch of cards. You know, this is one of those games that like took me like literally 2 hours just to like set up for the first time. To organize, I mean, for the first time, because you're putting cards into very specific folders. You're setting up the ship book in this elaborate way. It's a huge beast, but one that I kind of find myself very intrigued by. I do feel like I've been going on a little bit in terms of like mechanics of this. I do want to say in terms of how I feel about this in the early goings, I think the jury is a little bit out on the away missions themselves for me. I enjoy the story of them, the narrative on them, but it kind of suffers a little bit from what I was feeling with Tainted Grail, which is to say the actual act of like playing the game, doing those skill checks, doing the cards, doing the dice checks, kind of felt more tedious than rewarding. Even in the early goings. Tedious is maybe not the right word, but sometimes I kind of wished I was just progressing through like the choose your own adventures part of it. Like progressing and getting more story more quicker rather than being interrupted by dice checks. But that said, you know, that is what leads to the interesting result that you then have to deal with when it comes to the ship. So it's kind of unavoidable. And it could also just be that the game throws a lot at you right at the beginning. I kind of find myself frequently, even in the tutorial mission, just, you know, bouncing back and forth into rules I hadn't read yet. So that might just be smoothed out in the long run. It's hard to say. And I think a lot of this is going to, you know, similar to something like a Gloomhaven, is going to live by that scenario design effectively, like how they can keep those encounters and those away missions interesting in different ways.
Interestingly, you mentioned Gloomhaven, because when you were first describing the game, the first game I thought of was Gloomhaven, but obviously this is by the same company and the same designer as Tainted Grail. And this feels more like it appeals to the Tainted Grail crowd than the Gloomhaven crowd. I guess you can play this with a full like complement of 4 players, but from what I'm seeing here on BGG, it's mostly recommended for 1 to 2 players.
I think that's right. I had intended on playing this with a group, but I ended up getting a lot of these campaign games at the same time. So I decided to do this solo, but even after playing it the handful of missions I have, my take is exactly that. I don't think I'd want to do it with more than 2.
Yeah.
I think 2 would be a clean divide of just having 2 people control 2 crew members each. It kind of feels like it would work out that way. I do feel a little bit bummed that I've never enticed to take a full complement of crew on the missions, because I just can't imagine handling 4 people seems like that much fun to me personally.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think 2 would probably be the right way to do this. It definitely leans towards being something that is more soloable than Gloomhaven was, for my taste at least.
In any sense about how many missions are on this campaign?
Not really as yet, no. I'm sure that there's a lot of optional planets, because part of it is this, again, like an elaborate system map that you know the planets are connected to each other, and you're following through like a progression to get to the main story, but I'm sure that there's a lot of optional content along the way. So yeah, genuinely not sure, but interested to see where it goes. I'm starting to feel a little bit of the lumps that I kind of felt with Tainted Grail in ways more than one, where it's kind of like if I was designing this game more perfectly for myself, I would shave off so many edges, to get to like the stuff that I think is like the really fun core of it. But yeah, God, it's such an impressive, elaborate thing. Talking about like innovation in designs, which is what we're going to be getting to next. This has kind of felt like I've not seen a game trying to wrestle with this many systems that I traditionally associate with video games. It's one thing for a computer to be handling the stuff in the background, but when you're like doing it all on your own, it does sometimes feel like it's a little bit more exhaustive than it needs to be. But I'm admire them for trying, and I think once I internalize some of those systems and it starts to feel a little bit less like I have to be checking every single thing I'm doing, then maybe it will improve. But I think the jury's still out on this as a system and as a design, but gosh, what a cool thing that they're at least trying to do.
Yeah, definitely.
That is ISS Vanguard by Awakened Realms. So before we move on to our feature topic, a couple of things in the middle here is we're approaching the end of the month, which means that it's almost time for another bonus episode over on patreon.com. This is one of the ways you can support the show. Everything that we get from Patreon goes into providing equipment, providing hosting, and buying board games to cover. So it all feeds back into the podcast in a very direct way, and we just appreciate all of your incredible support.
I'm very excited to record the bonus episode. I've got some movies that I've just recently seen and things I want to talk about, so I'm very excited for that. For those who maybe aren't patrons but are interested in what our bonus content sounds like a little bit, I released a couple of bonus episodes last week with the World Cup coming up. What I did was I reviewed every team in the World Cup and compared them to a game in the Board Game Geek Top 100. So a little flavor of sort of like the off-topic tangents we take on the Patreon bonus episodes. That is free to everyone. So if you want a taste of some of the weird ways we go in the bonus episodes, feel free to check that out. That is available to everyone at boardgamebarrage.com/Patreon or patreon.com/boardgamebarrage. Also, I was on one of the most recent episodes of the Board Game Snobs. I was doing one of my very, very infrequent checks of Facebook when all of a sudden I got a message from Gabi, one of the hosts there, asking me if I wouldn't mind being on the show. I said, sure. I love their show. I love being on. And I said, yeah, sure. When? What topic? What do you want to do? And he's like, oh, how about right now? So it was an impromptu appearance, but a very fun one. So check me out on Board Game Snobs on the latest episode.
Okay, let's get right into the feature topic for this week, which is recent innovations or sort of innovations that have started to come into their own in board game world. So this is like whether we have seen interesting little design things take hold or stuff that is unusual that's being done with components. ISS Vanguard definitely struck me as a shoe-in for something that would be in this direction with the way that they're using that binder for like card manipulation and just saving your state between missions. I thought that was a pretty cool novelty that I had not seen before.
And just a quick aside, as an ode to our missing tank, we will do a card-by-card analysis of every card and innovation after this episode. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, who better to tell you everything about the board game innovation than the two of us?
Right, exactly. I think my win rate on innovation is in the single digits probably. But back to this kind of innovation. One of the innovations that seems to have been catching steam recently, and I first saw it with Mystic Vale a couple years ago, which was a John DeClaire game, and has popped up in a couple of his other games subsequently is the sort of card crafting system, the transparency system, where in Mystic Vale, it was a deck builder, but one aspect of the deck building was you were constructing stronger and stronger cards by putting cards into sort of plastic clear sleeves, and you would sort of be increasing the effectiveness or the power of the cards by just adding more to it by constructing cards by using the sleeving system. I know that it was re-implemented a number of times by John DeClaire himself, most recently in Dead Reckoning, but other designers have used it. I know 3000 Scoundrels recently did it. I know Canvas did it to great effect. That was a game about art and made for really, really beautiful cards that you constructed. So yeah, that struck me as one of the innovations that you didn't see at all, I think, really, 10 years ago, that has gained footing and people are sort of iterating on it and trying different ways to take advantage of that.
Yeah, this is one that I've kind of been itching to sort of see come into its own, because I remember like playing Mystic Vale and playing Custom Heroes. Custom Heroes is sort of a very goofy take on a shedding game where the deck of cards that you're playing with is just evolving over time as people are stuffing these transparencies into them, and the cards just getting more and more ridiculous. But that just kind of feels like a novelty, like a gimmick at that point. And it's actually only really with Dead Reckoning where I kind of felt that the system really did come into its own, because one of the things that game does is you have this finite complement of crew. At the start of every game, your crew composition is identical. It's just a small deck of cards. And what you are doing is upgrading them. They're learning. They're getting new abilities, like new techniques as the game goes on. So every time your captain comes up, he's now better at doing what a captain does, or, depending on how you've chosen to like craft him and what specific directions you've decided to upgrade him. So it does really feel, again, not to lean too heavily on stuff that comes from video games, but it does feel like this idea of like your crew leveling up and just gaining very specific expertise, despite the fact that it's still just a card that exists, in your deck of 12 cards. So yeah, I thought that's really, really neat. Like 3000 Scoundrels definitely sort of harkens back a little bit more to Custom Heroes, with just cards that are just getting more goofy with the combinations of them. I've not played Canvas, but I like the sound of your description of it there.
Sort of a tangential to this. This is not so much about card crafting, but just the use of transparencies, which I think sort of go hand in hand. One game that I have been interested in trying out, despite hearing mixed things about it, is Dive. This is a game where you've got transparency stacked on top of each other. It's sort of like supposed to evoke the idea of diving in the ocean. And one of the mechanisms is you're trying to guess how far down something is by looking through the transparencies and trying to guess how deep, that treasure is and where that octopus is and stuff like that by looking into the transparency. So not quite exactly what we're talking about when it comes to card crafting transparencies, but just the idea that the card crafting transparencies have made transparencies a component that you didn't really see too much of in the past. So just an interesting new component at the very least.
Yeah, like an example that springs to mind, and this is definitely like closer to a production thing more than like a design thing, but I remember even being struck by something as simple as Maglev Metro, having like individual tracks where you layer the transparent hexes over the top of each other to represent tracks crisscrossing each other over the board. And it's just, it's a novel, clean way to like present information, which is not something you used to see done quite that way until fairly recently.
Yeah, and also another game that jumps to mind when we're talking about transparency is Loony Quest. I don't know if you've ever played that, where you look at this shared image, and like one of them I remember was that you had this shared image of some goal you had to reach, but there were obstacles, and you had to, on your own transparency, draw a route from your character to the goal without hitting the obstacles, and then you would place your transparency on top of the image and see if you made it through. So again, just another novel use of transparencies where you didn't see them too often in the past.
Another component that I think that's kind of been in a lot of board games, like going back to like even classic board games, like you remember like Pictionary having sand timers in them, but it does feel like in the last couple of years we start to see like sand timers starting to be used in like really, really increasingly novel ways. I think the thing that kind of kicked this off a lot is sand timers as workers, as kind of seen in stuff like Kitchen Rush and Rush MD, where you can't move the workers, which are represented by these sand timers, until the sand runs out. And, despite Pendulum being a very flawed game, this was Stonemeyer's foray into that similar space of workers effectively that can't be moved until the timer runs out. There was something really novel about that. Like, I kind of likened Pendulum to a sort of, in an ideal situation, had this been implemented slightly better, as a sort of dance, like watching the timer tick down, being like, okay, 3, 2, 1, and move. Right. And then 3, 2, 1, and move. And like that's something, that sort of rhythm like that you associate with just the real-time nature of a component is not something that gets utilized all that frequently very well.
I remember one of the first times I really remember seeing this was with Magic Maze, which is the cooperative game where you're not allowed to talk with your teammates about how you're going to get through this maze that is ever growing as you add more and more tiles. And so that's that same sort of dance thing where you're like, you want to move this piece with 3, 2, 1, go, 3, 2, 1, go, and just waiting to move from one to another.
Kites, also a recent game that kind of also just like leaned into, and this was actually one of my, I hesitate to call it one of my hits of the year, but it's definitely a surprise that kind of came out of nowhere for me at Gen Con, and a game that entirely relies on just simply playing cards and sand timers.
And kind of a distillation of that idea. It's like sand timer play at its like most basic. There's not much to it aside from the sand timers and a deck of cards.
Totally. And then kind of also leaning onto something which is something you don't think about that frequently in the context of most sand timer games, which is it's the time that has already run out that is very important to consider, because you're flipping those timers back and forth. So if you flip a timer too quickly after it's just been flipped, you've effectively done nothing to that timer, which is just a nice little thing to have to like think about in the context of that style of real-time game.
Another thing I think we've seen a lot of recently are combining of sort of disparate mechanisms that you wouldn't necessarily think would work together, but have been tried together in interesting ways and have resulted in unique new game mechanisms. So one of the, I think, most interesting, although maybe most simple combinations was MicroMacro, which combines deduction with a Where's Waldo aspect, which you wouldn't think of. I think a lot of these combined game designs recently say, obviously Pictionary is something that was rife for combining because it has like this drawing element. But Where's Waldo didn't strike me as something that would be prime for piggybacking off of. But in MicroMacro, what you're doing is you're looking at this immense sort of Where's Waldo looking image where it's a city that is drawn but very densely. And you and your teammates are given a crime or something to try to solve, and you're solving it purely based on what you can see on the board. And there's this like element of time where you can see a character walk across the city and do different things, and you have to deduce, okay, they went to this house and then this happened. And it's this type of game that I had never seen before, much less considered. Again, like the idea of having the static image and having to do stuff from it in this Where's Waldo style struck me as really, really unique and a fresh way to combine other things you'd seen in the past.
Totally, because I think that there's the thing that we see a lot in board games, which counts as innovation in its own sense, which is kind of like taking two board game mechanics, like worker placement, deck building, like those hybrids, like were almost a dime a dozen in this last year. But like there's something that's so different and specific about saying, well, let's take something from outside of board games and like try to build a game around that. And like there's a couple of places where I think this has been done really well, like MicroMacro being one of them. But the Exit escape room games, which I'm a big fan of, started experimenting with a bunch of different formats recently, stuff based around jigsaw puzzles, and they were using those in very novel ways where you're actually using the puzzles after you've solved them to solve the actual puzzles of the game. They've started doing advent calendars every year, which the one for this year, I'm very excited to kick off in a couple of days, just because there's a huge novelty to that of just having a small discrete puzzle that you're solving one a day of. And again, that's something, a whole concept that's taken entirely outside of the board game space and added this awesome like interactive component that hybrids with these sort of like little logic puzzles that they are so good at designing.
And while it may not be as novel as taking something outside of the board game world and combining it with a tried and true board game mechanism, there have been innovations in combining more mainstream mechanisms in unique ways. And one of the games that pops to mind is Brian Burrow, which came out last year by Pierre Sylvester, which combines trick-taking and area control, which are two mechanisms that you wouldn't necessarily think would be blended together. Trick-taking games are generally purely in the realm of card games where there's no board involved, and area control games are fighty games, generally are more about dice rolling and stuff like that, or card play. And the idea of mixing this classic trick-taking system with area control is a fresh way to combine two, again, mainstream board game mechanisms.
I think that there's something that you gain in accessibility from these things, because I think when you see a game that uses trick taking that like attracts a certain audience, and then there's maybe some appeal in being like, okay, well, you played games like this before, but here's how this works with something else,
right?
And like I remember thinking that when we were talking about Kabuto Sumo and how that kind of uses those coin pusher arcade games,
Right.
And like it's kind of like, okay, well, what if we took that style of game and sort of tried to build a board game around that as a feature? And again, that just feels pretty novel to me, even though I don't necessarily think Kabuto Sumo works
Right.
as a game.
It certainly is unique for sure.
Totally. One thing I definitely want to talk about, which strikes me as a very, very recent innovation, which I first feel like I saw with Cryptid. I'm trying to think if there's maybe another example of a game that escaped me, which is of computer-generated puzzles. Another good example of this was Awkward Guests, where effectively you have a deduction or logic system, and you're able to create like almost countless combinations, almost countless solutions, almost countless puzzles just by virtue of like computer-aided design, like feeding your rule set into an algorithm which is able just to spit these out in multitudes. So you effectively have an infinite number of puzzles using the components that you have in the box. And one of the best recent examples in this, and I think the one that takes it to its most like extreme is Turing Machine.
Yeah.
And the way that Turing Machine looks when you look at the components for the first time, it's almost just like this marvel. Like if you weren't aware of like how it's constructed, it would just seem like magic, where you just have this massive deck of cards, and all these deck of cards are just pre-printed with like crosses and X's and numbers and puzzles, and somehow you get like a puzzle that uniquely combines those cards in a way such that the whole magic of the system works. As a reminder, you're kind of like creating punch cards which form like these unique grids of holes which you lay on top of these clue cards to determine whether they're fitting certain rule sets. And it's just like this combination of really clever physical component design to replicate something that is effectively a little microcomputer made out of paper in your hand.
Right.
And again, that's being aided by just having a theoretically infinite array of potential puzzles that utilize these components, these building blocks effectively. I think it's something that we're going to see a lot more of going forward. Like I feel like that sort of design where you can lean on the strengths of what allowing a computer to generate different iterations of the same puzzle using like a fixed set of components, I think is probably going to become very, very prominent. Because I've seen a lot of people just, on social media talking about how do you even design something like Turing Machine? Like, how is that possible? And like, there's a lot of very intricate computer wizardry that goes into something like that I think kind of gets lost if you're just like seeing the production without knowing what you're getting into. And I think that stuff extends to the sort of stuff we're seeing in like, the second edition of Mansions of Madness, where you have these elaborate apps that can then start to narrate and almost effectively game master a game without the need for a dedicated game master, which I think is only getting better and better.
Yeah, I think Destinies was another game that did this, where it sort of promised to be sort of like an RPG without the need of a game master or dungeon master to run things. App-driven sort of idea with that one too.
So yeah, I think that's going to do it for our rundown of some cool recent innovations that we've been seeing in board games. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. You can find us on all of our social media, whether that is on Facebook, whether that is on Twitter. You can just search for us in Google and you'll find us there. We also have a Discord. This is a hangout chat community where you can sort of meet with other listeners, other people who play board games, get into some digital games, particularly on Board Game Arena. You can find that at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. Thank you, as always, to Heart Society for our intro and outro music, What's in Your Mind, Kid? And goodbye.
Goodbye. Yeah, certainly looking at the pictures and you talk about it.
I've lost your audio.
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Give me 1 sec.
Can you hear me? Test. I can hear you. You can't hear me.
I was fiddling with this wire and I shouldn't have been.
Can you hear me? Hello. Test.
Hello?
Test. 1, 2, 3.
Nope.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Okay, I might just have to
exit.
Fiddle over here. Hello. I can still hear myself.
Hello.
Reaper.
Testing.
If I do this. Try set something now.
Test. Hello. Test.
Nope.
Test.
Nope. I might just have to leave this call and come back.
Okay. Hello. Can you hear me?
Hey.
Hey.
Still can't hear you.
Oh, that's weird.
Let me just see if it just is actually everything on my end. YouTube. It's like I can definitely hear myself coming through, but that might just be through the mixer.
Test.
Yeah, there's nothing coming through my audio here. What the hell? Sound settings.
Testing. Check.
Possibly have been.
Test. Check. Test.
Hello? Hello?
Testing. Test.
Nope,
Check.
still nothing.
Test.
This is still
Testing.
in. This is still in. That is still in. This is so bizarre.
Testing. Test.
In mode 2.
Test.
You can't change devices while recording. That's not great. That could be why. Can you hear me now?
Test.
Oh, wait, you could always hear me when we're talking about.
Okay, well now, test.
Hello.
Testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing. 1, 2, 3.
Hello.
Testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing. 1, 2, 3.
Let me see what happens if I try this.
Boop. Test.
Try saying something now.
Test. Boom. Bing bong 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 boom. Test. Can you hear me? Testing 1, 2, 3. Test. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Test. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Neelan can't hear me. I am going to say hello. Can you hear me today? Hello, can you hear me? No, he can't. Can you hear me? No, he can't. I need to keep talking because if I don't, then Neelan won't know if he can hear me or not. So here I am talking to no one but myself, trying to think of words to say. So instead, I'm going to say bing bong bong, bing bing bing, bing bong bong. He is fiddling with his cables. Hello, bing bang bong. Bing bong bong. I don't know what else. Oh, boop, test. Keep the audio going. Neelan, can you hear this? Neelan, can you hear that? Hello, I can hear you. You can't hear me. Testing. Keep it going. Let's read some games titles. 1750, Britain versus France. 1754, Conquest of French and Indian War. 1755, Rebellion. 1776, The Game of American Revolutionary War. 1812, The Campaign of Napoleon in Russia. 1812, The Invasion of Canada.
Hello.
Hey,
Okay,
oh my
that's
gosh.
good. Didn't fiddle
test.
with any of those dials,
Hello?
I don't think. Let's restart over here.
Testing. Can you hear me?
And
Hello?
we are back.
Okay, you can hear me?
Okay, so what was the last
good.
thing?
Good. Well, we got the outro, I can tell you that. Because I was trying to keep a steady stream of just words going. And then I realized halfway through it, I'm just saying absolutely ridiculous nonsense. And it's probably funny for the outro, so perfect.